Neil, what do you make of what we just heard there from the Treasury Secretary saying Americans ready to retire aren't worried about the day-to-day market fluctuations?
Yeah, it's easy to say when, you look at it in a hypothetical way. I think every time we get one of these bear markets or near bear markets, it hits differently, and it really does rattle confidence. Look, what's happened over the last few days is what looks like a stagflationary impulse. Some inflation, some slower growth is now looking like something worse than that, looking like an all-out recession. That's what we see in markets. That's what's happening with commodities, with the bond market. They're all pointing toward an out-and-out contraction in activity happening over the course of this year, and that's not where we were this time a week ago.
Yeah, and we're also hearing from Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan saying recession is more and more likely. Ron, you have the administration officials not only dismissing the stock plunge, but they're also brushing off the looming price hikes. Watch.
If cheap goods were the answer, if cheap goods were going to make Americans' real wages, real welfare better off, then real incomes would have gone up over that time. Instead, they went down because wages went down more than prices went down. So we got the cheap goods at the grocery store, but then we had fewer jobs.
Ron, is that a correct reading of America's wage gap? And will import taxes fix it?
Doubtful. And, on the one hand, yes, we did lose manufacturing jobs, partly as a result of automation and not just trade-related policy. But we also saw consumer goods fall precipitously from the 1990s on forward. So people did have more purchasing power when it came to things like televisions, phones, new technologies. And so that disinflationary or deflationary impulse has been with us for quite a long time. There's a really arduous struggle here in the White House to explain in a coherent fashion what the end game is. On one hand, Howard Lutnick over the weekend, our Commerce Secretary, suggested that we're going to bring back jobs where people put screws into iPhones. That's not
actually,
the type of
Ron, let me play that sound. We have that. Can we play it, guys?
The factories being built in America are huge.
That takes years, and you've said that robots are going to fill those jobs. So those aren't union
it's really automated
jobs.
It's automated factories, but the key is who's going to build the factories, who's going to operate the factories. The army of millions and millions of human beings screwing in little screws to make iPhones. That kind of thing is going to come to America.
Ron, continue your reaction to that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's the manufacturing base that we're looking for. We're looking really, if we would like to stay competitive with the likes of China and any other major competitor, we want advanced manufacturing with higher skill, higher paying jobs. I mean, those jobs of screwing, tiny screws into iPhones, which are being done for $2 a day in other countries, are not exactly coming back to the United States, nor is T-shirt making, sneaker making, seamstresses, things, these businesses that went away because other countries could do that far more cheaply, actually benefited Americans, even as manufacturing jobs were lost. So there's a lot of twisted logic in explaining these policies. Are they going to raise revenue to offset the tax cuts? Are they going to be permanent, or are they temporary negotiating tools to get Europe, China, and others to bring their tariff rates and non-tariff barriers down to zero and stop impeding U.S. exports from going overseas? I'm struggling with the pretzel logic here that exists, and seems that the markets, while they're off their lows of the day at this point, are struggling too.
Brian, Secretary Lutnick, using the iPhone example there. I know you've been talking to people who are experts in the tech industry. What are you hearing?
Yeah, well, I think when it comes to tech, I mean, there is some consternation that could be the next frontier of this conversation, because as we have those retaliatory tariffs that the United States, the so-called reciprocal tariffs that the United States will put into effect on April 9th, Wednesday of this week, that's kind of the starting point for all these other countries around the world to then tariff the United States. But here's the thing, because the United States doesn't export as many hard goods as other countries like Vietnam or China export to us, it might not be as impactful if another country really wanted to hit the United States where it hurts. So that's why you have the likes of some European countries that are suggesting maybe tariffing services, tariffing tech companies. If that is the case, that could be a whole nother level of discussion here, because when we talk about the tariffs, we're basically limiting ourselves to conversations of the physical goods that are put onto a ship, offloaded at the port of Los Angeles. But when you talk about companies like Google, like Meta, those are companies that make a lot of their money and are a huge part of the U.S. economy and the U.S. stock market. They don't export hard goods. So if you start to target those companies, that could be a big deal. And I want to point out, also that even with Apple, we talk about Apple, oh yeah, screwing those little screws into those phones. I mean, they are a services company, though. Most of their business is now subscriptions for Apple TV, Apple Music. If you tariff that, that would be a whole conversation.
One of the things that stood out to me was this quote from Dan Ives, the Wedbush Securities Financial Group managing director, and he said this: the economic pain that will be brought by these tariffs are hard to describe and can essentially take the U.S. tech industry back a decade in the process while China steamrolls ahead. Neil, what are you hearing more broadly from the business and finance community? Are big-time investors or executives souring on the Trump economic agenda, or do they have faith in this plan?
They are souring. The problem right now is there's a lack of obvious off-ramps. It took decades for these global supply chains to develop and be built to try and rip off the Band-Aid and change the entire structure of major industries overnight. They say it just can't be done. It takes years to rebuild these supply chains, even if you are trying to domesticate activity, reshore activity. So in the meantime, you're either stuck with much higher prices, much higher cost base, or disruption to how your supply chains work. And we're seeing that from Bill Ackman, a Trump supporter, a number of the kind of richer, titans of industry who are saying, we thought that Trump would use tariffs as a negotiating ploy, as a way to coerce countries into more favorable trade arrangements. That still might happen, but for the moment, they're not the off-ramps coming from the administration. They're not saying, if you negotiate with us on this, we'll hammer something out. We saw that with Vietnam just in the last 24 hours. They're saying just cutting your own trade barriers, your own tariffs isn't enough. And so until that changes, until there's a pathway to relax some of these tariffs that can make sense and kind of stay in place in an orderly way, I think we're going to keep seeing CEOs and the corporate leaders say this is a dangerous time for the economy.